In late October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's aircraft carrier, Zuikaku, was fighting for her life. Swarms of US carrier aircraft pounded the veteran ship during the climactic Battle of Cape Engaño, part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. By early afternoon on October 25th, Zuikaku was dead in the water, aflame and listing heavily to port. With their ship mortally wounded, her surviving crew gathered on the sloping flight deck, gave a final banzai cheer, and began to abandon the vessel. Minutes later, the proud carrier capsized and sank beneath the waves, becoming the last of the 6 Japanese carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor to be lost in World War II. Explore how Zuikaku rose as one of Japan's most formidable fleet carriers, her design and specifications, highlights of her wartime service, and how she met her end in a desperate final mission. Zuikaku was the second of the 2 Shokaku-class fleet carriers, built as part of Japan's pre-war naval expansion. Laid down in 1938 and commissioned in September 1941, she was among the most advanced carriers of her time, displacing over 32,000 tons fully loaded and stretching 844 feet, or 257 meters in length. Her propulsion system of 4 steam turbine engines delivered 160,000 shaft horsepower, driving her to a speed of about 34.5 knots, fast enough to keep pace with Japan's carrier task forces. She carried a designed complement of around 1,660 officers and crew, not including her air wing, and could steam over 9,700 nautical miles at cruising speed, giving her the range needed for long-range Pacific operations. In terms of aircraft capacity, Zuikaku was initially rated to carry about 72 operational aircraft, plus 12 spares. On the eve of the Pacific War, her embarked air group included a mix of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D-3 A-Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation in 1941. Zuikaku's armament and protection reflected a balance of offensive reach and defensive strength. She mounted 8 twin 127mm Type 89 dual-purpose guns along the sides of the hull. These 5-inch guns could be used against both aircraft and surface targets. For close-in air defense, Zuikaku was originally equipped with 12 triple-mount 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft guns. The 25mm guns, though numerous, proved to have limited effectiveness against fast-moving aircraft due to their small magazines and severe vibration when firing. In terms of armor, Zuikaku was better protected than earlier Japanese carriers. Critical areas like ammunition magazines were safeguarded by up to 165mm of armor on the belts, with armored decks up to 132mm over vital spaces. The waterline belt elsewhere was thinner, 46 to 75mm in most places, but backed by supportive steel plating to localize damage. Zuikaku and her sister, Shokaku, were built under Japan's ambition to field a first-rate carrier fleet. As part of the first air fleet, known more commonly as the Kido Butai, were intended to be the spearhead for long-range offensive operations. Zuikaku's very name, Auspicious Crane, reflected a hopeful omen of good fortune. Fittingly, she would earn a reputation as a lucky ship, emerging unscathed or lightly damaged from multiple battles that wrecked other carriers. However, as the war progressed, Zuikaku's design would be tested to the limits, and her capabilities continuously updated to meet new threats. Zuikaku was commissioned just in time to join Japan's carrier striking force for the opening offensives of World War II. In fact, she started the Pacific War as a frontline carrier of the Kido Butai. Under the command of Captain Yokokawa Ichibei, Zuikaku's first operational mission was the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Along with 5 other fleet carriers, she launched waves of aircraft that struck American airfields and warships in Hawaii, hoping to cripple the US Pacific Fleet's battleships in one bold stroke. Zuikaku's air group focused on hitting airfield targets during the raid, contributing to Japan's initial successes. This devastating opening left the United States reeling and showcased the initial power and potential of Japan's mobile carrier forces. Following Pearl Harbor, Zuikaku continued to spearhead offensive operations during Japan's early war southern advance. In January-March 1942, she took part in raids throughout the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, including strikes on Rabaul and the Dutch East Indies. In April 1942, Zuikaku joined Admiral Nagumo's carrier fleet in the Indian Ocean raid, where her dive bombers and torpedo planes helped hunt down and sink Allied ships. Notably, aircraft from Zuikaku and her sister Shokaku contributed to sinking the British carrier HMS Hermes and 2 cruisers, Cornwall and Dorsetshire, during these operations. These early victories further cemented Zuikaku's reputation as a formidable carrier. She emerged without significant damage while dealing heavy blows to the enemy. One of Zuikaku's most important engagements came in May 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Zuikaku and Shokaku formed the core of the Japanese carrier force. On May 7th to 8th, 1942, their planes clashed with US Navy carriers Lexington and Yorktown. In the intense exchanges, Zuikaku's air crews scored significant hits. Her torpedo bombers were credited with delivering crippling blows that led to the sinking of USS Lexington on May 8th. They also damaged USS Yorktown, though Yorktown survived Coral Sea to fight another day. However, the victory came at a cost. Shokaku was severely bombed and knocked out of action, and Zuikaku's air group suffered heavy losses in experienced pilots and planes. With one carrier damaged and the other short on aircraft, the Shokaku-class sisters were unable to participate in the next major showdown at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. This twist of fate arguably saved Zuikaku, as Midway proved catastrophic for Japan's other carriers. While Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were sunk at Midway, Zuikaku sat safely in port, replenishing her squadrons. This earned her further fame as the Lucky Crane, avoiding the disaster that befell her comrades. Through late 1942, Zuikaku remained a pillar of Japan's embattled carrier force in the Guadalcanal campaign. She took part in the carrier battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. At Santa Cruz, her flyers achieved a notable success. Together with other Japanese carriers' planes, they bombed and helped sink USS Hornet. Zuikaku again avoided serious damage to herself. Although targeted by US dive bombers, she maneuvered skillfully, and her anti-air gunners fought off attacks, sustaining only minor hits or near misses. The battle was costly for both sides' air groups, but Japan emerged with a tactical victory. After late 1942, there was a prolonged lull in carrier battles. Throughout 1943, Zuikaku saw no major action as the Japanese Navy, badly depleted of experienced pilots, avoided committing its carriers to battle. Instead, she spent much of this period refitting, training new air groups, and occasionally ferrying aircraft to distant bases. It was during this time that many of her armaments were upgraded to better prepare her for the next showdown. That showdown came in June 1944 with the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By now, Zuikaku had been made flagship of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, a testament to her status as the fleet's senior-most carrier. On June 19th to 20th, 1944, Ozawa launched Japan's last major carrier offensive against the US Fifth Fleet defending the Mariana Islands. The battle turned into what Americans nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as Japan's once elite naval aviators, now largely green replacements, were massacred by superior US fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Over the two-day battle, Japan lost 3 carriers, including Shokaku, sunk by a US submarine, and approximately 400 aircraft. Zuikaku survived, but even she did not escape unharmed. She took a few bomb hits from American carrier planes, though Japanese damage control teams managed to contain the damage. More importantly, by battle's end, Zuikaku had lost the majority of her planes and veteran pilots to combat or crash landings. The once mighty carrier air groups were effectively gutted. The Philippine Sea was a strategic disaster for Japan, Despite being quickly repaired, she faced an acute shortage of trained airmen and aircraft. Nonetheless, in October 1944, with the Allied invasion of the Philippines underway, Japan resolved to make one last grand use of its carriers, even if it meant using them as bait. Zuikaku, still considered fortunate and carrying Japan's hopes, would soon embark on her final mission. By fall 1944, the Japanese Navy was cornered and desperate. Allied forces had landed on Leyte, central Philippines, threatening to cut off Japan's access to vital resources. In response, the IJN launched Operation Shogo 1, a complex counterattack plan. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was tasked with commanding the northern force, essentially a decoy carrier task force meant to lure the US Third Fleet away from Leyte. Zuikaku, as the largest and most prestigious carrier left, served as Ozawa's flagship in this force. It was a role far different from her glory days. The once powerful carrier was now largely stripped of offensive punch and sent out as sacrificial bait. Japanese planners hoped that American Admiral William F. Halsey, commanding the US Third Fleet's formidable fast carriers, would chase Ozawa's carriers, thereby leaving the invasion fleet vulnerable to attack by Japanese battleships coming from the west. On October 20th, 1944, Zuikaku loaded the remnants of Japan's carrier air power and sailed with Ozawa from Japan into the Philippine Sea. Her escort included 3 light carriers, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, 2 hybrid battleship carriers, Issei and Hyuga, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. It was a formidable-looking force on paper, but largely an empty shell. In total, the 4 carriers of Ozawa's 3rd Carrier Division could field only about 108 aircraft between them, a fraction of their capacity, and most of those were inexperienced aircrews or second-line planes. Despite these shortcomings, the carriers sortied bravely, knowing their mission was essentially a one-way trip. On October 24th, as US reconnaissance detected Ozawa's approach from the north, the decoy plan began to work. Halsey's powerful task force took the bait and steamed northward, away from Leyte Gulf, in pursuit of the Japanese carrier force. That morning, Ozawa launched what aircraft he could in a token strike against the US fleet. From Zuikaku's decks and the light carriers, several dozen planes took off, many piloted by inexperienced youths. This strike was largely ineffective. Most of the Japanese aircraft failed to find Halsey's distant carriers, and either were shot down or turned back low on fuel. In any case, virtually none of Zuikaku's planes returned to her. By the end of October 24th, Zuikaku had effectively no air group left to speak of. She was now a carrier in name only, carrying little more than the proud history of her past battles. The stage was set for the final confrontation on October 25th, 1944, the Battle off Cape Engaño. At dawn, Admiral Halsey's carriers launched massive airstrikes upon spotting Ozawa's force off the northeastern tip of Luzon. Wave after wave of US Navy aircraft swept down on the 4 Japanese carriers. Zuikaku came under heavy attack from several directions. Her captains and crew fought back with everything they had, maneuvering at flank speed, swerving to avoid torpedoes, and throwing up dense flak from her dozens of anti-aircraft guns. But the Americans were overwhelmingly powerful and numerous. Dive bombers from carriers Essex, Intrepid, Lexington, and others aimed for the flight decks and hangars, while squadrons of torpedo-bombing Grumman Avengers attacked from low altitude. By mid-morning, bombs and torpedoes found their marks on Zuikaku. She sustained multiple bomb strikes that ripped open her flight deck and set fires raging internally. Soon after, aerial torpedoes struck her hull. According to post-battle analysis, Zuikaku was ultimately hit by an onslaught of 7 torpedoes and 9 bombs during these attacks. One by one, her vital systems faltered. Engines were knocked out, compartments flooded uncontrollably, and fires spread through the hangar deck. Damage control teams attempted to counter-flood and keep the ship afloat, but the cumulative damage was too extensive. Water poured into her port side, and Zuikaku began listing increasingly to port, as well as down by the stern. Around noon, with Zuikaku clearly dying, Vice Admiral Ozawa made the decision to transfer his flag off the stricken carrier. He and his staff departed in a small boat and moved over to the cruiser Oyodo, from which Ozawa continued to direct the remnant of his force. Meanwhile, the pounding of Zuikaku continued. US pilots pressed their attacks until the once mighty carrier was left dead in the water, billowing smoke. By about 1 p.m., the order was given on board Zuikaku to abandon ship. The flight deck was now sloping sharply due to the list. Sailors gathered on the exposed side of the ship. In a moment, filled with both pride and sorrow, Zuikaku's crew lowered the Imperial Navy ensign and performed ceremonial last rites for their ship. They stood in formation and offered a final banzai salute to the Emperor and their beloved carrier before casting themselves into the sea. Just 16 minutes later, Zuikaku rolled over to port and sank, stern first, beneath the waves. Zuikaku's end was accompanied by heavy loss of life. Out of her approximately 1,700 crew and officers on board that day, an estimated 840 were killed in the sinking. Another 860-plus survivors were rescued from the water by Japanese destroyers Wakatsuki and Kuwa, as well as other escorting ships. Captain Kaizuka Takeo, Zuikaku's commanding officer, who had been promoted from captain to rear admiral just days earlier, chose to go down with his command. One of the 840 lost. With Zuikaku's sinking, all 4 Japanese carriers in the northern force were destroyed at Cape Engaño. The light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda were bombed, torpedoed, and sunk earlier in the day, and Zuiho was fatally hit and sank in the afternoon. Ozawa's decoy force had been annihilated, but it had achieved its aim of diverting Halsey. Indeed, while Zuikaku and her sisters were being pounded by Admiral Halsey's aviators, far to the south, another drama was unfolding. The Japanese central force of battleships and cruisers had surged through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait. That force surprised a group of US escort carriers and destroyers off Samar, leading to the famous Battle off Samar. In a sense, Zuikaku's sacrificial mission succeeded. Halsey was lured away, allowing the Japanese battleships a chance, albeit brief, to wreak havoc. However, even this gambit could not turn the tide of the war. Kurita's battleships were ultimately driven off at Samar, and the overall Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in a decisive Allied victory. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled and lost, suffering catastrophic losses of ships and men. The sinking of Zuikaku symbolized the twilight of Japan's naval air power. In the immediate aftermath, the Imperial Japanese Navy was left decimated. Most of its remaining carriers, battleships, and cruisers had been sunk or heavily damaged. Leyte Gulf delivered a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. Zuikaku's loss, alongside those of Musashi and countless other ships, meant that Japan no longer had the means to challenge Allied control of the seas. Although some ships and a few newly built carriers remained on paper, they were either too few, too poorly equipped, or lacked fuel and air groups to be operational. After October 1944, Japan's carrier force ceased to be a meaningful offensive threat. When the war entered its final months, desperate measures like kamikaze attacks became Japan's primary naval air strategy, a stark contrast to the sweeping carrier strikes that Zuikaku had once led. In Japan, the loss of Zuikaku was kept relatively quiet at first, much as other naval defeats had been. But in hindsight, Japanese naval officers recognized the ship's fate as a turning point. Zuikaku had been one of the last links to the heyday of the Imperial Navy's carrier force. Her destruction underscored that Japan's ability to wage conventional carrier warfare was effectively over. The combined fleet was shattered, and the initiative at sea had irrevocably passed to the Allies. Allied sailors and commanders, on the other hand, viewed Zuikaku's sinking as a major success and a form of closure. Nearly 3 years earlier, her air group had attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, she was at the bottom of the ocean, avenging those early defeats and proving the overwhelming superiority of US naval power by late 1944. Historians often regard Zuikaku and her sister Shokaku as among the most capable carriers of World War II, noting that they were the most successful carriers operated by the Japanese in terms of operational output and resilience. Zuikaku's career spanned the duration of Japan's naval fortunes, from triumphant offensive operations in 1941 to 42 to the defensive, sacrificial mindset of 1944. Her story provides insight into how quickly the tide turned in the Pacific War. In less than 4 years, the Imperial Navy went from having arguably the world's most powerful carrier strike force to using its last carrier as bait in a fallacy. In the broader context, Zuikaku's destruction, along with the annihilation of Japan's carrier fleet at Leyte Gulf, validated the US Navy's overwhelming carrier-centered strategy. IJN Zuikaku holds a place in history as the last survivor of the first generation of Japanese carriers, and her fate vividly illustrates the rise and fall of a naval empire. From her auspicious beginnings as a state-of-the-art warship to her fiery end as a decoy, Zuikaku's journey is a microcosm of the Pacific War itself. Her story is one of the immense gambles of war and the swift changes in fortune that defined World War II at sea.